So, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. First of all, I'd like to thanks to Heinrich Boell Foundation for inviting me to this beautiful city, Tbilisi. I would also like to thank to our host and the city government, as they provided this beautiful hall. And last but not least, I'd like to thank to all of you for coming this evening. It's I have one uneasy task. I was told that this meeting is about urban development and urban activism. That I was asked to be involved in and to talk about the urban development in post-socialist cities from my perspective. As I've done most of my work in my home city, Prague in the Czech Republic, and also in other cities in Central Europe. Even this would be a difficult task, because I can speak for the urban development for days. I'm a teacher at the university, so to choose what might resonate with your experience here. So I'll try to attempt to share my experience from my city, and I'll hope that some of my experience that I observed might also be useful or resonate with some of your experience here in Tbilisi. This is not my first visit to your beautiful city. I'm here for the 4th time. I was in Tbilisi 3 years ago, and I can see that, at least I think that the traffic changed. It's much more difficult and dangerous to cross this roundabout here in front of the city hall. It wasn't easy 3 years ago, but I think it was much more difficult today, and I tried to do it 3 times. And then I was here twice in 1980s, in 1985 and in 1988, when as a student we succeeded in a strange way to escape from my country and travel through some countries of former Soviet Union. And we always went to Caucasus and then here to Georgia and Armenia. So I love to be back here tonight with you. And tonight I will speak about the second round of transition. Meeting our colleagues in the West, they often tell me, why are speaking still about post-socialist city, post-socialist development? You've got this transformation in 1990s, and now you're part of the global society, so just use talks about the neoliberalism and global urban development and so on. But I'm telling to them, we haven't finished yet. Maybe the government's date in 1990s, but look to our cities, there's still a lot of work to do, and we have a lot of heritage, a lot of legacy from the socialist time, with which we still struggle and have to struggle. So I'll try to go through a little general overview now. It's 25 years ago, in 1989 and 1998, we refused communism, at least in my country and I think even in the other countries. And through the 1990s, what I observed was that we were building free market capitalism, mostly through government interventions, and then starting actually what the capitalism is about. If I look on the period in the decade after the millennium, after 2000, until roughly 2008, 2009, when the economic crisis came, I would see this time as a quite massive urban restructuring influenced by the market forces. And in my country, although by the European Union enlargement. And then, since the economic crisis came, I've seen that this, booming times has been suddenly changed. And what I can observe is a disappointment among population, frustration, uncertainty, but also lack of vision. Lack of vision which concerns not only economy and society as a whole, but also the urban development. So my question is, where we are now in 2016? And a colleague of mine, he started to speak about the long-term transformation process in Central and Eastern Europe. And we distinguish what we call multiple transformations, and the 3, let's say, sequential steps in this transformation. It was only in the 1990s when our governments, they established the basic principles of market allocation and democratic policy making. And this was just, establishing rules of the game. And these rules of the game, they brought the first impetus for population, for individuals, households, and firms start to behave within the market environment. So actions and practices started to develop, and they influence the social processes, which influence society as well as the city, and changes in social structures. And only these, practices that started to be, and I would say, slowly imprinted in the change of the urban landscapes through the adaptation of the urban environment to the new conditions. And while the first thing can be done by the constitutional changes, by the legal changes relatively quickly, within a few years, then how long does it take to change the practices and adjust to the new norms? It's a question of generation, maybe 2 generations, because the socialization process, we are taking certain habits from, our parents, families, and so on. How long does it take to change the city with all the physical environment? I don't speak about individual changes, I'm thinking about the city as a whole, and I think this is a process for decades. When we started in the 1990s, the government has quickly done these legal transformations, influenced by the Washington Consensus and other neoliberal guidelines. So the key questions were beside the democratization, issues like liberalization of foreign trade, but also privatization of domestic property, liberalization of park prices. So we actually established the local markets and attempted to link ourselves with the global capitalism. But this was only about the rules of the game. And then we started to influence, what has been happening in society and cities. They become internationalized. If I look in my society, on the key sectors in the economy, your police uses Škoda cars. They are produced in my country, it's Volkswagen ownership, isn't it? In my country also produced Toyota, Peugeot, Kia, and a lot of other cars, but all this segment is foreign owned. The banking sector is foreign owned. So huge internationalization of what is happening in the city. And just try to think who is building the key projects in your city. It's not always international investment. It's sometimes very importantly behind. The other thing was the economic restructuring. Our cities were heavily built on the industries. But these industries declined. You've got the services. And in major cities and capital cities, you've got high-end producer services, high salaries, where a young generation gets jobs. But not for everyone. In cities, we also got other type of services. Look at the supermarkets. Look who works there for what kind of salary. So we've got this dualization of the service sector, but also a lot of people are outside of the job market. But this produced the social differentiation, social polarization. Much, much higher social inequalities than we which used to live in during the socialist times. And these changes, mixing with the West, also brought kind of the postmodern culture, individualization on one hand side, on the other hand side of the choice. You have much wider choice, but actually, who is capable to take off from this choice? Again, depending on your incomes, and also depending on your life preferences. Also, the individual and family life change very significantly. I remember that 20 years ago, I think the average age of women when the first child was born was about 20, and now in my country it's over 30. We don't have any more families who demand, larger houses. So this dramatically changed the landscape of the city and demand for housing. And all of this was framed in what we call neoliberal politics, and suddenly focused mostly on the economic development, decentralization of decision-making to localities, on individual projects, and we gave up long-term planning. Even planning hasn't been a popular word for many years. So when I think about our cities, they go through a deep, I would say, revolutionary urban transformation. We quickly change the political and economic principles, but the urban structures, they have a high inertia in time. So what we still witness now is the adaptation of the urban environment to these new market conditions. So while we live in a city of capitalists, also again, there are still plenty of the socialist legacies. And these are the two coins, two sides of the one coin. And in my city, you know, this confrontation started in the city center. As you can see on the pictures here, many buildings and streets were dilapidated, heavily dilapidated. There have been empty places and they've been quickly fixed and built up. But in time, you know, the capital investments moved on the edges of city and behind the socialist housing estates, you know, from Tbilisi or from other cities in the region, we've got, you know, villages. With usually people work in agriculture, who travel from industries to the city, lower class, with the low technical equipment in these villages. But now if you look there, in these villages we now have a suburbs with monster houses for a very different class of people. So if I look, you know, at the differences of flows of investment and disinvestment in the socialist and post-socialist city, it differs radically. In terms of what is happening in the suburbs, in the housing estates, or in city center. So I see my city as a city of revolutionary changes. And now I'll just quickly go with some pictures to show you where I've seen a major transformation in which kind of the hotspots in the city. In the beginning, it was the city center, and what has happened there was the commercialization. Most of the many non-commercial activities have been just displaced. Housing has been pushed out by the commercial activities. So this was the major outcome of the commercialization. Also, it brought much more cars in the city, as you can see here. So we've got this conflict between cars and pedestrians. And as you can imagine, we also got a conflict with the historical heritage in the city. The second thing, if you look at the inner city locations, was a gentrification, a process I knew from in my studies in the West in the early 1990s, process happening in inner city neighborhoods, where the property is redeveloped, quite often enlarged, and original population is being displaced. It started to happen in my city in Prague around the mid-1990s, and it's going on. And now we have some neighborhoods which are being called by local people as being gentrified. But nearly for all these 20 years, it hasn't been seen as a controversy or conflict by population. You know, most people would say this is the natural rectification of injustices made during the socialist times. It's just beautification of former bourgeois neighborhoods, so they are getting back to their original glory. But it's only new generation of last 5 years, rather young people, who start to critically look, you know, the social consequences of gentrification. All over town, you've got new housing construction in condominium districts. All housing which is built with dwellings for sale to ownership, not rental stock, for sale to ownership. There's also a number of controversial issues between these condominium districts. I guess also in your city, you see that some of them get to swallow not only green spaces, but also some of the old housing. So it also sort of gentrification in certain parts of the city. And some of these, you know, condominiums, they started to be built until after 2000, so 2004, 2005, as gated communities. So now in Prague we have over 100 such gated places, clusters of buildings with the gates, with the private guards, and it's associated with the segregation. But it's also other thing which I dislike about it. It's usually a large cluster in the city through which suddenly you cannot pass. You know, formerly the city was accessible, people could walk through, but now it's enclosed. So something that completely changes the landscape, residential landscape in the city. And you've got immigrant neighborhoods, because our society is economically quite doing well. So the economy is doing well, and we got, since mid-1990s, quite an inflow of immigrants, especially speeding up after 2000, a little bit slowing during the days of economic crisis, Now it's going up. Just in the city of Prague, we now have about 15% of foreign born population. It was 0 25 years ago. So the Czech cities were ethnically homogeneous. Not like your cities here in the region, but still I think in the socialist time there's been more ethnic homogenization within the Soviet states. So the immigrant neighborhoods is another issue. And now with all this xenophobia related to migration in Europe, we see also these struggles about these neighborhoods in our city. So I'll speak a little bit more about the immigrant neighborhoods later. And then, during the post-socialist development, the implemented decline of industries and emergence of brownfields. And in some places, the redevelopment of brownfields, that's where the capital investment is interested in. But in some other areas, usually more remoted, the brownfields, they stay with us. So it's one of the major challenges because of unused land and also severe contamination. And we've got something what you can see in the West, waterfront developments, because we have a river, and suddenly the river is a beautiful setting to look at, and also the beautiful setting that you can earn a lot of money if the office tower is on the river, and if the new condominiums are built on the river. So that's an extra premium for construction on the river. And we have a new retail and entertainment node. I guess like any other city, just going from the airport, you've seen there was a East or South there, huge mall up there. And I don't know what does it make to be traveling in a city, because in my city 20 years ago, most people were going for shopping in the city center. And I would say most people are taking car and shop at the city outskirts. So a lot of shopping facilities at the city outskirts. And we don't have this only in major cities. We have these, shopping districts on the edges now, even not only medium, but also small-sized towns in the countryside. So the, central parts of the village, they are getting emptied, and we have these, zones outside. Again, a lot of controversies around it. In my country, liberal approach since the 1990s, no interventions to the size, location, and so on. So now we have oversupply of these facilities. And we've got a massive construction of offices. Because central planning, they needed offices, but the capitalism needed even more office space and more administration. And, in modern enterprises, modern business services, they need large open office spaces, which cannot be constructed in the city center. So we see these massive movements of offices to office parks on the, out of city locations and edges of the city. And we've got suburbanization, both non-residential as well as housing. And I'll pay to suburbanization more time in the course of my lecture. So if I look on a city, it's a full of localities of dynamic change. And I just gave examples of those. Those most marvelous, those where the capital investment has came in. But we can look what is in between these places. And between these places there are some of the ordinary neighborhoods which don't go through spectacular change. But in between we also find socially excluded localities. Kind of segregated places concentrating low income, low mobile population. We find them especially in industrial towns, in rural environments, but we find also some socially excluded places even in the capital city. And maybe socialist housing estate, it might be, edge of town rural housing, it might be former industrial buildings. Over 600 socially excluded localities were mapped in the country as a whole. So it's not, it's quite spread phenomenon. And in a city, and that's for the activist groups, we also get places of alternative culture. Whether it's a building which has been left off by the public government or the state government unused, so it was squatted and used for the, social activities. Or it might be former heating plant, like at the bottom, which lost, its reason in the housing estate. Now it's used by the local groups for teenagers. and so on. So there's plenty of such places. So it's not only, you know, high capital investment which is changing the city. The city has a number of these, you know, pictures which we have to recognize. So again, where we are now in 2016, and the question is whether we live in capitalist society, in capitalist city. Because I think and I thought that actually this was in a way the desire or the goal of the early 1990s when we established this, you know, market rules and democratic policy making. And I must admit that we do live in capitalist society and that we are part of the global urbanism. And the global urbanism is very much associated with the neoliberal capitalism. That's what I was asked to speak about. On this picture you can see Los Angeles at the bottom. Postmodern prototype of the city of the future. But you can see also a picture on the left is I think from Yerevan. That could be in Ukraine, it could be anywhere in Eastern Europe. And it's not Manhattan, that's Warsaw. So you can see that, you know, the visual images now actually can be taken in any part of the world. And what I would argue is that the post-socialist urbanization is actually part of the global capitalist urbanization, because we can see very similar forms of this market urban development around the world, in all countries which apply to capitalism. And the spread of suburbs, gated communities, what we've seen on the pictures, is linked with the expansion of capitalism. And the capitalism, that's now the dominant socio-economic order on the globe, on the planetary scale. And I think nearly without alternatives. And the same rules of the game, they produce very similar outcomes, because they are given by the social practices of firms, households, and also governments, under very similar, you know, political, economic conditions of neoliberal global capitalism. So it is similar culture, similar rules of the game, similar principles, and similar outcomes. Of course, in our countries, we can say that it's coming to the landscape of the socialist legacies. So the result is not crystal clear and the same everywhere. But we can find a lot of very common features. So just coming out here, I can see this blue or blue-green tall tower juxtaposed to, you know, small buildings here in the historical core. And I think if I will come to Vilnius, I will see the same, not to any other city. So this is very, very the same. It's a free market capitalism which has guided in the beginning the economic reforms, which shaped the social practices, and now it's shaping the city, the suburbs, gentrified neighborhoods, and the segregation. So my argument is that we are part of planetary urbanization, global urbanism, because we are part of the global capitalism. Because we have these capitalist conditions of urban development. We have the similar forms of worldwide urbanization, despite the role of the socialist legacies. And in a way, we might be amazed at what is happening in the city, because we can see all over us the cases of urban development under these conditions. And we can see how, you know, the evolutionary change of the principles produced urban changes, and how the global neoliberal capitalism interplays with the local legacies to produce this landscape. And I think once we see that these conditions are very similar, there is also a lot to share between us. So in 2016, we are part of global urbanism because we are part of global capitalism. But again, do we live in capitalist society, capitalist city? We do, but the question, for me, this is not the question of today. Because transition, for me, is not a finished project yet. And as I said before, looking at this graph, I said that you know, we change the rules of the game. People and firms are changing practices, especially those which have the capital and are progressive. They are really making a print on the city. So what we see is this urban spatial change. And as I said, this will take a decade. So what is happening now is this urban change and struggle, how this urban transformation will look like, what kind of the city we will live in. So in this part of my presentation, I want to focus on urban transformation, challenges, and also some of the pitfalls. And I guess that if there are people from the city government, from the citizen groups, even from the private businesses, we all would like to live in environmentally friendly, socially inclusive, and economically efficient cities. And I will give 3 cases on suburbanization and sprawl, on the polycentricity in our cities or centralization, and then on the segregation and conviviality. So first on suburbanization and sprawl, and now all this will be examples from my city, from Prague. So as I already said, we have plenty of new residences in suburbs as well as non-residential premises. I'll just tell what is key on the data. In a 10 years period between 2010, 2001 and 2011, we've got nearly 50% growth in Prague suburbs. So the population around Prague in these suburbs increased by nearly 130,000 people. 130,000, this in my country means one of the important regional centers. It will be 5th largest city in the Czech Republic. So just within 10 years, we've got the construction of one large city right outside of the Prague boundary. This is the city. That's it. These are the places where the new housing was constructed, all the black spots. So it's not in morphologic terms one city, in one place with one infrastructure. It's spread it. This is what we call sprawl. These pictures shows the Prague boundary, and that most of the new locations are right outside of the Prague, because Prague government regulates what is constructed within the city, but not the governments outside the city boundary. So then we get, these extensions of municipalities without any urbanism, any urban plan, even in our country, which I think has quite substantial regulations. And the same along the highways, districts of logistic parks, industries, and so on. So we have sprawl. And this is for you just to compare on this smaller picture, the black part, that's the socialist housing estates. And then you can see the sprawl, and it's in the scale. So you can see how compactly the socialist city was constructed, but what we are getting now. And you can just think how people get to jobs to the city. Only by car, because of the public transportation cannot provide service for it. That's one of the issues. And there are plenty of reports in the West, which are just pointing on the negative social, economic, environmental consequences of sprawl. And the question is whether with the starting condition of the compact cities, we can learn from this experience and build a rather fringe city than the city from Florida. I think Miami is on the bottom picture. And this is the final picture for this. In my country, I see the sprawl as an outcome of 2 forces. On one hand side, we have the demand and supply of investors who are seeking for land, but also local politicians who are eager to get these investments and are selling this land to investors for a cheaper price than in the city. On the other hand side, we have territorial governance, and in my country, we don't have any regional coordination. It's individual municipality who is responsible for the construction of housing as well as non-housing. And in Prague region, we have, beside Prague, 200 independent municipalities, and they are just competing for these investments. So sprawl is a result of this. It's a result of the localization preferences of households and firms and freedom of market choice on one hand side, and then fragmented governance of territorial development on the other hand side. Missing coordination on the level of metropolitan region and the national government. The national government is leaving the urban development to municipalities. So the second issue is polycentricity. I've shown this picture of Los Angeles, and Los Angeles is known for having polycentric, urban pattern, with a lot of centers spread it in the tissue of Southern California. So we also thought that with this, new retail, new industries, new logistics centers, we'll get the new, job centers outside of the city. And having them outside of the city, they will provide jobs to people in these more rural places, or in new suburban places, and so on. And then instead of, this commuting to the city center, which we see during the socialist time, not only by rail, but heavily by buses, that this might be replaced by more, reciprocal relations and transversal commuting also outside of the city. So what has happened? These pictures show Prague and Brno. We will not look at it in detail, but I think the presentation will be here, so you can have a look at it later. But generally, in 20 years' time, we've got a deconcentration of population. That's what we've seen with the residential suburbanization, but quite strong centralization of jobs. So people live in suburbs, but jobs are concentrated in the center city. We've done a number of analyses on commuting flows. All of them shows that there is sharply increasing proportion of population going for jobs to the larger cities, because there are no jobs in the countryside. We also look on, this analysis of this reciprocity. No reciprocity. It's just a one-side direction of flows to the major cities. From all the municipalities, they have but one choice: go to the metropolis. Other job places disappeared. You can see it on this map. I don't know whether the white bubbles. You can see there is plenty, maybe 500 white bubbles. That's all these places which lost jobs over past 20 years. Only those which are in the black, they got new jobs. Beside Prague, it's Mladá Boleslav, there's very Škoda companies and some small villages. So what we have seen is that the geography of job is about a huge concentration usually to major cities and decline everywhere else. So we have a few instances of these new suburban job centers, and that's the new capitalist suburban economy. But we have many instances of job decline in former job centers, and that's the socialist legacy which is actually wiped out in the capitalist economy. So large cities, they strengthen position, small cities, they are disappearing from the map of the jobs. So on the one hand side, we have a massive residential deconcentration, and then growing concentration of jobs and centralization of community in the urban cores. So the key issue is actually what this duality of deconcentration of residences and centralization of jobs is creating in the city. It's not only demand for the transportation infrastructure, for city services. It's a question of also social cohesion when people are commuting and don't have a time to be in the communities. It's a question also of availability of jobs in the former rural places. A question of the spatial justice. So I'm just trying to say that the problems of the city now is not only the city itself. It's a whole, city region about which we need to speak. And the final case is on segregation and conviviality. I guess most of you would know what segregation means. That's when, ethnic groups or economic groups concentrate in particular places, mostly linked together with those with similar social and ethnic status. Conviviality is about, daily interaction, daily passing. I don't need to know you in the city, but I know that you are there, you're part of my neighborhood. And you might be different, but still we can live together. In a socialist city, we've got quite homogeneous socio-spatial structure. And with the establishment of the capitalism, there was a social inequality increasing. We've got a differentiated housing supply. So now if the young generation wants to get housing, it's not just one possibility of the housing estate. You have a wider choice. But it might go range from, quite luxurious condominiums to place in social excluded locality. So from the social polarization, you've got the places of segregation. And all over my country, we have very different places of segregation. They might include the housing estates, which become a concentration of Roma population. People of gypsies, Roma population, which went from old industrial towns, and they were settled to these housing estates and concentrated some segments of it. We also get high expensive condominiums, where 99% of customers are of post-Soviet origin, Russian-speaking, mostly from Russia, but also from other countries from the Soviet Union, Russia. That's what you'll find in my country as well. And you'll get a container housing for other gypsies resettled from a town. And we get a Vietnamese town within the city of Prague, and declining housing estates, and former agriculture buildings, which has been reconstructed for foreign immigrants working in industry, and gated communities, which you already mentioned. So a huge spectrum of these formations going from gated communities through social excluded localities to immigrant enclaves. And I'll just give two examples. One of them is a new immigrant neighborhood where Vietnamese population settled down. In the city of Prague, we have only about 1% of Vietnamese population, from the 15% of foreigners. In this locality, the Vietnamese population is about 9%, so 1/10 of the neighborhood population is Vietnamese. If I would ask my students in a class, they would guess it's 30%, maybe 35%. It's very difficult because people think it's much, much more, because they are meeting now people of different race in their neighborhood. It's not like this. We've done detailed research in this neighborhood, which is about 10,000 population of the residential places. And we found no segregation. Even in prefabs, we haven't found any single entrance when there will be more than 30% of Vietnamese. They're quite dispersed in the neighborhood. If you look on Ukrainians or Russians within the same neighborhood, maybe a little bit less of them, but they'll be very heavily clustered. Not Vietnamese. So, then we look on actually why people look on Vietnamese like this, what is happening in their life. And we found that in the neighborhood there are two things going on. One of them is very racist and xenophobic attitudes. Usually people take them from the public discourses, spread it by media, and then through the local, discourse. Because people often do not have the direct experience from the direct life, or embodied experience, encountering them. Then we found that they actually do have. But when they speak rather about this general pictures taken from media than about the daily experience. And we found that in the daily experience they have a quite neutral or positive experience of this convivial encounter. So what I see is that our population now is learning to live in a multicultural state. And it might take time to fight xenophobia. And actually lots of citizen groups and NGOs are involved in this issue now, fighting against xenophobia. It's not only Vietnamese. With this recent migration development in Europe, actually Vietnamese are starting to be seen as ours. We also have other concentration of foreigners that might interest you more. We have in the places of industrial production huge concentration of guest workers, most of them coming from Eastern Europe, formerly from Ukraine, but because of the restrictions we have more and more people from eastern parts of the European Union, especially from Bulgaria, rural regions, also from Romania, Poland, Slovakia, also from Moldova, because Moldovians they are getting the Romanian passports and so on. And this is the case from Pardubice, which is our regional center. On the edge of this town, there are former military barracks. Most of our cities there were having army barracks, army left them. And these barracks have been converted to huge dormitory for manual workers in electronic industry. It's about 800 who live there. They cannot have families in them, despite some of them do have, but unofficially. It's very poor housing environment, no green spaces. actually the middle of barracks, there is just asphalt plate where you can train to drive in a car. That's your view of this. So they live physically separated, segregated, their daily life is they are shipped by buses just to their workplace and then back again. Every day they don't know whether the work will be there or not, because work is not at home, they do it here. Actually in socialist time you've got this, travel to work within the city regions. Now I see this travel to work within the European scale. That's how actually our cities start to be linked on more European global scale. We've seen the development of kind of the xenophobic attitudes, even racist attitudes in the local neighborhoods, because people don't know these people, they don't meet them. And again, it's one of the localities where we try to fight. And now it's more complicated. It's fighting poverty, opposition on the labor market, segregation, and also xenophobia. So it's on the economic front, social front, and the cultural front, and the geographic marginalization as well. So after these cases, where we are now. So transformation is an unfinished project. As I said, we are working on what is happening in the city and struggle for the urban transformation. Because what we can see is that something what I call new path dependencies might develop. Situations when something will be here with us and it will be difficult to escape from it after 10 years. Once the segregation develops, it will be difficult to fight with it. So I tried in my country to argue that we have to anticipate actually what is happening and try to suggest alternative paths. Rather compact growing city, rather more socially mixed and cohesive than segregated cities. Rather more bicycles and even more cars in the city. So that's these struggles. So we live in a capitalist city, but I think we don't have yet mature capitalist society. Precisely because we are still learning how to deal with the capitalist society. And Raoul Dahrendorf already in 1990 anticipated that this is task of 60 years, which are barely enough to lay foundation for society, which will be able to withstand all various situations. So, what we learned from the challenges of sprawl, that we have a fragmented, locally based planning and land development, and we miss integrated metropolitan governance, horizontal and vertical coordination, still missing. So it's the market and local government who is doing the job. From the segregation, that we have xenophobia, stereotypes, rather assimilation policies based on we know what you should do. We don't need to know it from you. But we are learning slowly to live in socially diversified society. I see there is a lot of practices and obstacles on our road. What I see is vested interests of politicians, investors, owners, but also inhabitants, individual people, in sustaining the current mode of social urban development. Once people move to suburbs, they want to care for suburbs. They don't want to care for the city. So we see this competition not only for investments, but people want to have their home. They don't want to care for the rest of the society, because they were told this is the capitalism where we live. What I see is practices of delegitimization of others and opponents and missing consensus. Especially in my city, I see this between the local politicians and local activist groups. Local activist groups say the local politicians are not competent to do their jobs. And local politicians say the activists are not competent to their jobs. And then business say neither politicians nor activists are competent to their jobs. But this is not the way how to achieve some common platform to get somewhere in the city. This is the most common politics which I see, the most common representation. Instead of pursuing kind of vision, a program and project, 90% of those are only non-competence of the others, not about what my competence is to offer to you. So it's mostly about the individual interests, and I don't know whether you can see it in real life. There's the public interest. The public interest is lagging behind the individual interests. But again, in 1990, our Prime Minister at that time, and later President Václav Klaus told us that if we fulfill individual interests, then this will bring us to the common best future. But capitalism is not about it only. And what I see also is exclusive discourses and actions of individuals and pressure groups. That's what I've already commented. Everybody is just taking about its stake and trying to speak to this part of the public who listens, not to the rest. We still miss long-term holistic and inclusive strategies. So, urbanization for me is not simply a reflection of the preferences of individual households, firms, or individual interest groups. It's societal choice. And I think we haven't gotten to this stage yet, even in my country, in my city. Because if it's societal choice, then actually it's also about the mutual recognition, respect, and the negotiation. And with the recent development in my city, I see how hard task is it. And I guess it won't be somewhere else. So where we are now, we are in the second round of transition. In the first round, this was when we established the conditions and principles of capitalism. But it wasn't enough. We need the second round, and we are asking what kind of a city, what kind of a society we want to live. And this is the struggle which we are fighting now. In the 1990s, the political environment was hostile to urban planning, participation, coordination. After 2000, I've seen the planning for the capital investments, implementation of the market forces. After 2010, this disappointment and seeking for change. But I've seen it among politicians, in the business sector, in the civic sector. All of them started to be in favor of novel urban development, of new planning methods. And this is also associated with the growth of grassroots activism. And if I look at a lot of people who started as grassroots activists, they are now in the urban government. Some of them are now at the head of the important political parties, as a Green Party. So the local politics going up. And I think that's the way in which we can see. So while in the 1990s I've seen it was the politicians who ruled the country, set up the rules. In 2000s it was the capital. Now I see very strong power battles in our city around the issue of representation, the discourses. Who is telling what and what is received? It's a battle in media and battle in social media with this policy of mutual legitimation. So, and I'm really now at the end. So, what I see that is developing, this might be encouraging for you and might be common between our societies and cities, is that the current generation, especially of young people, is very critically reflecting on current urban and social development issues. I would even speak about the new left which emerged. Well, 15 years ago, nobody wanted to be on the left beside the old communists. So new left thinking around the social and socio-spatial justice. There's also a number of radical young people who think or would fight for alternatives of capitalism. But I would say most of them rather think and try to work on what I would see the plurality of urban future, about the inclusiveness, around the issues of ethnic or sexual minorities, around the issue of right to the city. It's a new generation with new values. And I think what they fight with, despite they sometimes are not able to articulate it, with what I would call the modernist concept of the single city. Among certain generation of city planners, I see they want to have one universal view of the city, neighborhoods, transportation system. But now I see the tolerance, to see there might be variability between neighborhoods. There might be both use of the car as well as a bicycle. Green spaces as a development, conservation and development. We don't have to have, one single solution for the city. But it's much difficult to, reconcile this, because it's not about one group dictates. It's about the negotiation. And it's also by the generation of people who now got education in the West, but the education different from the Washington consensus. And who think about the alternative mechanisms in the city, that is the distribution or rationing of the markets. So it's not only about markets, it's about sharing spirit, it's about the social argument. What is happening? It's not that this is the end of the capitalism in our cities. What I see is that, all these activities contribute to what we can call institutional thickness and institutional reform of this free market capitalism of 1990s. And actually, this is for me negative message to some of the radical activists. It's actually fostering the stability of the capitalist order, because it's building more complete capitalism. So, it's about the city of automobile as well as the city of bicycle, about the city of developers as well as the city of citizens, about the city of segregation as well as the city of legal encounter. All this is actually that, the sequence of the multiple transformation turnaround is the, negative experience of a number of cases in the city, which show that there is a lot of practices if you want to fight it, whether it's corruption, whether it's neglect of the local population during the development projects, whether it's neglect of greenery in favor of cars. And this calls for a change in the practices. Why now we have some of these grassroots activists as a key politicians now? They influence the legislation, they influence the preparation of the new Mainstream strategic plan of Prague. Because if they want to change practices, they need to go back to the legislation. I wouldn't say to change completely the rules of the game, but make the rules of the game, more complex, for a complicated society, not only this one which is based on the free market. So, my message for the end of my talk is that institutions matter, and this is the second round of transition, which is our project. From grassroots experience, if you want to change practices, you want to have to change the rules of the game. City planning, as well as the national legislation. So from grassroots movements to the government, that's the way how to do, and I think it's happening here in Tbilisi. So what kind of the city do you really want to live in? That's a question for you, Tbilisi. Thank you for attention.